Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, we're having at least some modest technical problems. My understanding is that we're not going to be able to project on this TV. We're going to try to fix it over lunch hour so your attention will be drawn to the screen that is by the jury door. So if we need to reposition it so that you can see it better, let us know. But you're going to be restricted to that one until we have some time to do some investigation. With that said, Mr. Kaiser, the state's next witness.
Thank you, Judge. State calls Amanda Wiltzius.
Thank you. Ms. Wiltzius, if you'll come up, please. And face the clerk and raise your right hand for administration of the oath.
Do you swear that the testimony you are about to give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do.
Thank you. Come over and have a seat. And that microphone arm will swing in and out for your convenience. And if you'll swing it in towards you, please. Thank you.
You have to literally talk right into it. Okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Would you state your name, spell your first and last name, and please speak up so everyone can hear you.
My name is Amanda Wiltzius, spelled Amanda. Last name Wiltzius.
Where do you work?
I work at the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory.
What's your job? Sorry.
Located in Milwaukee.
Apologize for interrupting. Sorry. What's your job at the Wisconsin State Crime Lab?
I am a latent fingerprint examiner.
What's the job of a latent fingerprint examiner?
As a latent fingerprint examiner, I process evidence that is submitted by law enforcement agencies to develop latent prints. I will then compare any latent prints that are developed with known standards, write a report to my findings, and testify in court as necessary.
How long have you done work as a latent print examiner?
I have been a latent print examiner since 2008.
What kind of training do you have to do that work?
I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in Forensic Science from the University of Central Florida. I have a 400-hour internship in the latent fingerprint unit with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department Crime Lab. I have over 400 hours of continuing education in the area of latent fingerprint comparison, development, and photography. I also have a 1.5 years or so apprenticeship in the area of latent fingerprints.
Showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 143 for identification. Can you tell us what that document is, please?
This is a statement of my qualifications.
Is it a true and accurate summary of your training and experience?
Yes, it is.
Will be Exhibit 143 into evidence.
No objection. Received.
Ms. Wiltzius, showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 144 for identification. Could you tell us if you recognize what that document is, please?
It is the first page of my report.
If I didn't copy the back, I apologize. I'll give you a different one.
No, I'm sorry. The back is on the back of the paper.
Thank you. Is 144 a true and accurate copy of your report in the case involving a victim named Chase Fleichauer?
Yes, it is.
Move 144 into evidence.
No objection. Received.
Generally speaking, when you are presented with an object and asked to see if you can determine whether or not there are identifiable fingerprints on the object, what is it that you're looking for?
I'm looking for latent prints. I'm looking for little lines on the item. If you look at your hands, the palms of your hands and the face of your fingers, you will see that you have lines, which are ridges. And I'm looking for that replication on an item. So they look basically like lines on an item.
What physical process causes the impression of our fingerprints that you've described, the lines, to be left on an object?
Your pores on your hands excrete water, fats, amino acids, proteins, salt. All of those get excreted through your pores and that's what keeps your hands moist. Your hands also pick up contaminants from other items that you touch, such as your hair, your face. Anytime you touch an item, you pick up contaminants from that item. Those contaminants, along with what is excreted from your pores, coats your hands. When you touch an item, a replication of those ridges that you see on your hands, that is left behind with that residue. And that is what we call a latent print.
You identified an item as item, for Wisconsin Crime Lab purposes, you identified an item as item C1, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
What was your description of that item?
A Taurus PT 709 9mm handgun.
Can you tell us, because we already heard from Mr. Distarkey, can you tell us whether you examined it for fingerprints before or after Mr. Distarkey examined it for DNA?
I examined it after he did.
How, if in any way, do you at the crime lab coordinate the circumstances so that his work in examining for DNA doesn't affect your work in examining for fingerprints?
With some items, we will have a conversation as to which areas are better for DNA and which items are better for latent prints. With an item such as a gun, there are very specific areas that he will swap for a gun that he just knows they're not as good for fingerprint development. So he will generally, or DNA will generally swab those areas of the gun.
I'm going to ask Detective Nicola to bring your item C1, the Taurus PT 709, up for you to look at while I ask you a couple questions. Is that okay?
Yes.
All right. I realize Detective Nicola has to hold it, so if you need him to move his hand, please let me know. When you say that you and Mr. Distarkey worked together in order to be sure that his work didn't affect your work, where on it did you agree that he would test for DNA because you wouldn't probably find any fingerprints there?
With this one in particular, we didn't have that conversation because this is a firearm. He has very specific areas that he will swab, or any DNA analyst would swab in order to get what they need out of it. They generally will leave the smoother areas for latent prints.
Ejector, this is
Narrative?
Foundation.
Well, it's narrative as well,
Narrative
so.
also.
Question, Mr.?
Thank you, Judge. If I could ask Detective Nicola to move his hand from the handle, I'd like to ask you whether or not there's anything about the handle of Exhibit 22 that would affect your ability to extract any usable DNA or any usable fingerprint sample from that area.
The hand grip of this gun is very textured, which makes it difficult for us to recover latent prints on that textured portion of it. Yeah.
There's also a place on Exhibit 22 where one would grab the slider because it's a semi-automatic to pull it across the top of the gun. How, if in any way, does how that is structured in the pistol affect your ability to extract a usable latent print off of it?
That area is also very textured and would also therefore be difficult to recover latent prints from that area.
I understand. So tell us what it is about a textured surface that causes you to not be able to get a usable latent print off of it.
Latent prints adhere much better to very flat, smooth, clean surfaces. Your finger on those types of surfaces has a uniform pressure to it generally, and can adhere those ridges that we're looking for much better. When the surface is textured, your finger doesn't uniformly cover that surface. Portions of your finger may touch it, whereas the areas that are lower in the texture, those won't get your fingerprint as well. It makes it very difficult, if not impossible, for us to recover a latent print off of it because of the different levels to it.
Where, if anywhere, on Exhibit 22 did you examine in order to try to determine if there was any identifiable latent prints there?
I examined the entire gun. Even though it is unlikely for us to recover fingerprints from, or any friction ridge detail from a textured area, it doesn't mean that it is impossible. So I will continue to look at all areas, smooth and textured. It doesn't matter if it was originally swabbed for DNA or any other process that was done to it. I will examine the entire weapon, in this case, in its entirety.
When you say look, what process do you use to look? Just your eyes or anything else?
The first process that I use is ambient light. I look at it, I turn it, see if the light will bounce off any friction ridge detail that was left behind, any of those latent prints that were left behind. After that, I will use an alternate light source. In our case, we use a laser. What that does is we look at it, and occasionally we will get a latent fingerprint or a latent print that will fluoresce automatically just with using an alternate light source. In this case, I did that as well. When I did not see any, I moved on to our next step. The next step for this item was cyanoacrylate fuming, which is superglue fuming. What we do is we heat a special type of superglue in a chamber. That superglue becomes a vapor. That vapor covers the entire item with a very thin layer of superglue. That superglue adheres more to the friction ridge detail that is left behind because of both the moisture and the salts that are in a latent print. When it comes out of that chamber, like I said, the entire gun is coated. There are times where it is so thinly coated that I can't see any white residue from the superglue, and at times I can. If I see anything, any friction ridge detail at that point, I would photograph it. In this case, I did not, so I moved on to the next step, which is dye stain. I spray dye stain on it and allow it to dry. After that, I'll look at it with the laser, and that dye stain fluoresces, which allows me to see any friction ridge detail that was developed with that superglue. In this case, I saw friction ridge detail that was not suitable for comparison. There was not enough to even photograph that, so I deemed it not suitable for comparison, and that was the end of the process.
And thank you, Detective. And what do you mean by not suitable for comparison?
There has to be enough detail in that friction ridge detail that is left behind. In those lines, there has to be enough there for me to be able to do something. So if you, again, look at your hands, those lines that you see, those ridges, they form patterns. Within those patterns, there are also unique characteristics that individualize each person's fingerprint. If there is not enough information, if I only see a few straight lines and nothing else to it, it's not suitable for comparison. I can't do anything with those lines. It's not suitable for comparison at that point.
1 second, I apologize. Showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 66 for identification. Actually, it's already been. Showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 66. Can you tell me if you recognize what that object is, please?
Yes, I do.
What object is that?
It is a gun magazine that is submitted as item L1 for crime lab purposes.
Was it a magazine belonging to a PT-709?
Yes,
And did you subject that magazine to the same processes that you've described to us here?
yes, this magazine went through the same processes that I described with the firearm.
And did you do the same thing with the unfired cartridges that had been in the magazine?
No, I did not. I used a different process on those.
Okay, so let's stick with the magazine for now. The magazine itself, not the unfired cartridges that you had received with it, what results of your testing did you get with the magazine itself, Exhibit 66?
There was nothing suitable for comparison on the magazine.
Then you said you used a different process for the bullets that had been in the magazine?
Yes, I did.
What did you do?
With the cartridges that were in the magazine, I again visually looked with the light. I looked at them with the laser as well. And then they went through a process called gun bluing. It is a chemical that the cartridges, or part of the cartridge, so the head stamp doesn't go in this solution, but the rest of the cartridge will go into this solution. And what it does is it very lightly etches that cartridge. It changes that coloring on the cartridge from being a brass color to a little bit darker, almost a blue color to it. The area that would have friction-ridge detail, those oils, those waters, salts, amino acids, proteins, all of those items protect the cartridge from that solution. So when I take it out of the solution, the area that was protected by those oils does not change color, which allows me to visualize it at that point.
What were the results of that test in terms of whether or not you found any identifiable latent fingerprints on any of those unfired shell casings from your item L1?
I found no suitable friction-ridge detail on those.
Did you also examine what was identified to you as being your item C2?
Yes, I did.
And what was the relationship between C1 and C2 at your lab?
They were both in the same box, the same packaging. They came in together.
All right. What was C2?
C2 is a Taurus PT-709 magazine, and it was loaded with cartridges when I received it.
So that magazine was different from the one you've identified as L1 Exhibit 66, is that correct?
Correct.
All right. So the magazine which you identified at your lab as being C2 that came to you with the PT-709 we saw earlier, what, if any, processes did you subject it to in order to determine whether or not there were any latent prints on it?
I did the same process with that magazine as I did with the Firearm and this other magazine that I have, that for the lab purposes was L2.
So limiting our analysis, our questioning here to just the question of the magazine itself and not the bullets, what results did you get?
No suitable friction-ridge detail was found on the magazine.
And how many unfired cartridges did the C2 have in it?
4.
What, if anything, did you do with those in an attempt to try to develop any latent prints that you could identify?
I did the same process with those as I did with the other cartridges, visually examined them. I looked at them with the alternate light source, and then also did the gun gluing solution on those as well.
What was the results of that testing?
No suitable friction-ridge detail was found.
Showing you what is marked as Exhibit 176 for identification. Can you tell us if you recognize what the items are there?
Yes, this is what I designated as item C2.
So that was the magazine with the 4 unfired 9mm cartridges, is that correct?
I see the magazine.
Oh, I thought the boxes would have the cartridges in it, I could be wrong.
I do not know what's in the boxes.
Are your initials on the boxes?
No, they are not.
Oh, okay. Did you examine an item C3?
Yes, I did.
And your item C3 was what?
One unfired FC 9mm Luger cartridge.
And you exhibit 35. Can you tell us if you recognize that item, please?
Yes,
What is it?
this is what the lab designated as item B, one unfired FC 9mm Luger cartridge.
What did you do with exhibit 35?
I did the same thing with this as I did with the other cartridges, visually examined them, looked at them with the laser, and then applied the gun gluing solution to them.
What conclusions did you reach?
There is no suitable friction ridge detail found on this item.
You also identified an item J, is that correct?
Yes,
What was item J?
one fired FC 9mm Luger cartridge case.
Showing you exhibit 61. Can you tell us if you recognize what that is, please?
Yes,
What is it?
it is item J.
One fired 9mm Luger cartridge case?
Yes,
Did you subject it to the same processes that you've described for the other unfired cartridges?
yes, I did.
What, if any, results did you get?
No suitable friction ridge detail was found.
How, if in any way, what, if any, characteristics are there about fired or unfired cartridge casings that cause, that affect your ability to extract a identifiable latent print from them?
Cartridge cases are a very round surface. If you think about when you hold something around about that size, even say your pen that you're holding, very little of your finger actually touches that cartridge. So you have very little surface area that's actually touching it to leave an impression. With a fired cartridge case, it is exposed to extreme heat in the firing process. The extreme heat will at times evaporate the print because, as I said, there's a lot of water in your latent print that you leave behind. In the firing process, it evaporates that residue that's on it, as well as the process of how a cartridge is generally handled, placing it inside a magazine. Your skin is pliable, so as you're pushing down and exposing that extreme pressure, say with your thumb, let's just say, you are pushing together all of that residue. So you're no longer leaving a very clean impression behind. Instead, you're squishing all of that residue together, which makes it, again, very difficult for us to do anything with that process.
Going back to the pistol itself for a minute, besides the textured areas of the pistol, what, if any, other characteristics do pistols have that sometimes can limit your ability to extract a identifiable latent print from the pistol?
Besides the texture of it, the firearm has oils that help it function, and those oils also prevent us from easily developing a latent print, because in something like that, when you touch an item, you're not necessarily leaving something behind, but instead removing some of that oil that's on there that allows the firearm to even function. Also, with the handling of a firearm, what happens to it after you even touch it? Is it placed back into a holster? Is it placed between clothing and wiping that friction-ridge detail away? Friction-ridge detail is very fragile, and so placing it in something such as clothing or a holster can wipe that friction-ridge detail away.
When you say friction-ridge detail is very fragile, what do you mean by that?
I mean, it can easily be wiped away. There's nothing adhering it to the surface. When you touch something, if you would go ahead and just wipe across it, oftentimes that friction ridge detail that you have left behind, or that latent print that you have left behind, will get wiped away with a swipe of your hand or a swipe of clothing, easily cleaned away.
You know, one place people might think of that you might look for a fingerprint on a pistol might be on the actual trigger itself. Do you recall whether or not you looked on the trigger of the PT-709 to see if there would be any identifiable ridge detail there?
Yes, I did.
And what did you find?
There was no suitable friction ridge detail there.
And what is it about the nature of a trigger itself that might make it difficult for you to locate identifiable latent prints there?
Oftentimes, a trigger is textured to aid in gripping. And with the pressure of pulling on that trigger, you are again flattening your ridge detail and pushing it all together, which would prevent us from getting anything that would be suitable for comparison.
What about the size of a trigger?
Size, again, is very small, so very little of your finger is actually touching it.
Ms. Wiltzius, thank you for your time. Judge, appreciate it.
Thank you. Mr. Gray.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, as I understand your testimony, you checked the unfired Luger cartridge. I'm going down your report, ma'am. Do you have it there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. The unfired Luger cartridge, you checked. The Taurus handgun, you checked. The Taurus magazine, you checked. 4 unfired Luger cartridges, you checked, correct?
Yes.
1 unfired Luger cartridge, correct?
Yes.
And 1 fired Luger cartridge, correct?
Yes.
And a magazine loaded with L2. What? Oh, I see. L2 would be 7 unfired cartridges that were in the magazine, correct?
Yes.
And you checked all of those, and your report states that there were no friction at ridge detail that was suitable for comparison, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now let me ask you, did you ever check the barrel of the firearm for fingerprints?
I examined the firearm in its entirety.
Yeah, my question was, do you remember checking the barrel for fingerprints?
I did not take apart the weapon, but the part of the barrel that was exposed, yes, I did examine it for friction ridge detail.
Do you have notes on that? Do you have your notes with you as that you did check that?
I do not, in my notes, I do not.
I asked you a question. Do you have notes here? I'd ask you to answer the question.
Thank you, and if you can answer the question, Ms. Wiltzius.
Apologize. I do not have notes with me up here.
Okay. Do you have them with you here?
Yes, I do.
Could she get those notes?
Yes, if they're hopefully readily accessible.
So while I'm getting the notes, I'll travel to another area. Would it be fair to say that when you hold something tight, you're more apt to get fingerprints than if you don't hold it tight loosely?
That is not necessarily true.
What do you mean it's not necessarily true?
What I mean is, it depends on how tight you hold something. If you are holding something very, very tight, you can squish that friction ridge detail together, that residue that is from your friction ridge detail, you can squish that together, which would prevent me from being able to see anything that is suitable. Oftentimes, when you lightly touch an item, you can leave a print behind because that's just a very light touch, easily transferring that residue very cleanly.
And Ms. Ellenwood does have her notes, Mr. Gray, that she's delivering to her.
Could you look at your notes and see if there's anything in your notes about examining the barrel for fingerprints, and if there is, how you did it?
I did not specifically say in my notes that I looked at the barrel of the firearm.
Thank you. And you did that examination how long ago?
July of 2018.
And you were never asked to examine a holster for fingerprints, fair statement?
No, I was not.
And getting back to the holding of a firearm, you testified that, I thought I understood you, quote me, correct me if I'm wrong, that if you squeeze very tightly, you could smudge up any possible fingerprints.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, but if you hold on to it tightly, at some point in time, you could get fingerprints, correct?
It is a possibility, yes.
That's all I have. Thank you, ma'am.
Nothing else?
Thank you. Stand down, Ms. Wiltzius. And I believe you're released from your subpoena.
I ask it be so.
Thank you. Mr. Kaiser, state's next witness, please.
State calls Heather Williams.
Thank you. Ms. Williams, if you'll face the clerk and raise your right hand, please.
You swear that the testimony you're about to give in this matter shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you. Come over and have a seat, please. And if you'll swing that microphone arm right up to your mouth, please. Mr. Kaiser.
Thank you, Your Honor. Would you state your name, spell your first and last name for us, and please speak up so everyone can hear you.
First name is Heather, Heather. Last name is Williams, Williams.
Where do you work?
I work at the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory, located in Milwaukee.
What's your job there?
I am a firearms and toolmark examiner.
How long have you worked for the Wisconsin State Crime Lab?
A little over 4 years.
How long have you been a tool marks examiner? I'm sorry, how long have you been an examiner as you've described?
Approximately 4 years.
What's your training and experience to have that occupation?
I hold a Bachelor's of Science in Law Enforcement and Justice Administration with a minor in Forensic Science from Western Illinois University. Also completed a 525-hour internship at the DuPage County Forensic Science Center. And I completed the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory Firearms Training Program. It's an apprentice-type training program where you get hands-on training as well as classroom-like instruction, much like an apprenticeships for like an electrician or a plumber.
What, if any, annual checks on your proficiency are there in your profession?
So we are required to take annual proficiency tests to maintain our proficiency in the areas that we are authorized to do casework in. In order to continue to do casework, we must pass those proficiency tests.
How many times have you done that?
I'd say approximately I've probably passed around 6 to 8. I cannot recall exactly how many.
Showing what's been marked as Exhibit 145 for identification. Could you tell us if you recognize what that document is, please?
I do. This is my statement of qualifications for the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory.
Is Exhibit 145 a true and accurate summary of your experience, education, and qualifications?
Yes, it is.
Move 145 into evidence.
No objection.
Received.
Showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 146 for identification. Could you tell us if you recognize what that document is, please?
Yes, these are the reports that I completed for the specific case. I know that I completed these cases based upon my name and signature on the reports, as well as I noticed for this case based upon the laboratory case number on each report.
You have in your report identified an object for the crime lab purposes as item C1, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
What was item C1?
Item C1 was a 9mm Luger Taurus model PT 709 semi-automatic pistol.
Ask if Detective Nicola can approach the
Yes.
analyst. Thank you. I'm having Detective Nicola show you what we identified here in court as item 22, Exhibit 22. You're satisfied it's not loaded, right?
Correct, yes.
And it has a trigger lock on it?
Correct, yes it does.
Is Exhibit 22 your item C1 that you identified as a Taurus model PT 709 9mm semi-automatic pistol?
Yes, it is. And I know that because on the actual firearm, I have not only put the laboratory case number, also the item designation for the case, my initials, and the date that I analyzed that piece of evidence.
What did you understand your task was to be then in relation to Exhibit 22?
One of the first things we do as a firearms examiner when a firearm
Judge,
is submitted.
I object to this, is not responsive.
Sustained. And the question is, Williams, what did you do with this firearm? Not what do you do generally, but what did you do with this firearm?
I'll ask a different question.
Thank
I
you.
apologize. Ms. Williams, given the totality of all the evidence that you were given in this case to examine, what was it you were either told or believed you were to be doing?
With this firearm, I was to do a function test on the firearm to make sure that is a functional firearm and that it is safe to test fire. And then once I test fired that, I would take test fires from that specific firearm and analyze it and compare it to the submitted fired evidence for this specific case.
What did you do in order to determine whether or not it was a functional firearm?
I completed a function test of that firearm.
What's that? What makes up a function test?
So a function test of a firearm is where I will look at the condition of the firearm, as well as I will check all safeties of that firearm to make sure that they are working. And during that function test, I also determine that that firearm, in this instance, is safe for me to test fire.
So, if you remember, how many safeties does this firearm have?
If I could recall, this one had approximately 5 safeties, if I recall correctly.
All right. And I'd like you to talk about them in whatever order you choose.
Yes, one of the safeties that are on there is going to be a safety lever. In order to fire this firearm, that safety lever needs to be turned off or in the unsafe position. Another one is going to be the trigger guard, if I remember correctly. Is there a way I could possibly get my notes to confirm all of the safeties?
I think so. Where are they?
I have them out in my binder.
Miss Ellenwood is helping me with that. I appreciate that very much.
So as I understand, Ms. Williams, you don't have current recall, and looking at your notes will help refresh your recollection. Is that correct?
Correct. Looking
Thank-
at my notes will help me recall all of the safeties associated with this specific firearm.
Thank you.
You have your notes?
I do, yes, thank you.
Ms. Ellenwood.
So in my notes, I did talk about the safety lever. There's also a trigger insert, which is in the trigger area of the firearm. This is gonna be a little tab that needs to be pushed in order for you to be able to pull that trigger all the way for it to be fired. There's also a loaded chamber indicator on this firearm, meaning that there is a little tab that will pop up when there is a unfired round in the actual chamber of the firearm, showing that it's in the to be fired position and that it's loaded and ready to be fired. There is also a key lock in which there is a key that can be associated with that firearm, where if it is locked, it is not able to be fired. And when it's unlocked and all other safeties are in the unsafe position, you can fire that firearm, as well as a disconnector, which that's going to have to where it's not going to allow for that firearm to be fired without that trigger being pulled all the way and having it released.
I'm going to ask you to look at a couple of pictures of a couple of them. Judge, I asked to publish Exhibit 21, which has been admitted.
Without objection, granted.
Oh, and you can't see it because that screen's not working. I apologize. Would you mind coming down and taking a look at the screen over there? Could you show us, oops, sorry. Okay. On Exhibit 21, is one of the safeties you were talking about shown there?
Yes, you can actually see a couple of the safeties. So this right here is going to be that safety lever that I talked about. This right here is showing that it's in the to be fired position. If you were to push that up, it would then be in the safe position. This is the trigger insert that I talked about, which is another safety associated with that firearm. That tab needs to be pushed in so it is flush with the trigger in order for it to be fired. And then you cannot see it, but up here on the top, this is where that loaded chamber indicator is going to be. This, you're seeing that it's not showing that it is loaded because that loaded chamber indicator is down.
Well, we're actually going to show you Exhibit 47, if we could, which is
Yes.
also admitted, and ask you about the one you were just describing.
Okay.
So give me 1 second. We have to scroll through some other ones to get to it,
Okay.
which we can't show. So give us 1 second.
Okay.
Thank you. 47. Exhibit 47, in relation to the safeties that you've described, what is that?
This right here is going to be that loaded chamber indicator that I discussed. So right here, this is showing that in this chamber of the firearm, there is an unfired cartridge or loaded round in the actual firearm.
Because that lever is up.
Correct, yes, it is up whenever that is actually loaded. When there is nothing in that chamber, that safety is going to be flush with the top of that firearm.
Thanks. I think you can have a seat again. I just want to ask you one more question about the safety that's actually on the trigger. And if I'm wrong, please tell me, okay? But my question would be, would the goal of the safety on the trigger be so that if one were to realize one is pulling the trigger back, it would sort of signal to you, hey, you're pulling the trigger back, are you sure you really want to do that?
With having your finger on that trigger, you would be able to feel that trigger insert. So you'd be able to physically feel that safety on the firearm.
Thanks, Detective. What did you do to determine that it was a functional firearm?
To determine that it was a functional firearm, I went and determined that all of the safeties were working for the specific firearm, that the condition was in good condition, and that it was safe to test fire. And by test firing that, it allowed me to produce test fires, so fired cartridge cases and fired bullets, I was able to determine that this is a functionally firearm.
How many test fires did you do?
In this instance, if I recall correctly, 2 test fires for this one.
Where do you do that?
We have a range in the firearms section of the lab in which we will be able to test fire any of our firearms in casework.
Because it's in your lab, it's a controlled environment, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Once you've made those 2 test fires, what do you do with that ammunition that you fired?
With those, we were going to collect those, and then instances in which we have fired evidence submitted for that specific case, those test fires are compared against that submitted fired evidence to determine if the submitted evidence was or was not fired in that specific firearm.
So, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you fire a cartridge in the pistol, in the semi-automatic pistol, the thing that us guys call a bullet, a layperson would call a bullet, that comes out the front, is that correct?
Correct, yes. The bullet expelled through the barrel of the firearm.
And that's an object you're able to collect?
Correct,
So you
yes.
collected 2 of your test fires?
Yes.
Then, in a semi-automatic, what happens to the casing that the bullet had been in?
The cartridge case is going to be automatically ejected out of the ejection port of that firearm.
And did you also collect those 2 fired cartridge casings?
Correct, yes, I did.
And what aspects or characteristics of the fired cartridge casings do you use to help you determine whether or not fired or unfired cartridge casings that have been recovered came from that firearm?
There's going to be different areas from the firearm that a fired cartridge case is going to be fired in that's going to leave specific markings on those fired cartridge cases. For example, the firing pin will leave what's called a firing pin impression on a fired cartridge case. The breech face or bolt face, which is the area that the firing pin will come out of, will leave specific markings on also the cartridge cases. It's these markings that we look at and compare on our test fires to the submitted evidence to determine if that evidence was or was not fired in that firearm.
I should have asked this earlier, and I apologize. When you got Exhibit 22, the pistol that Mr. Nicola was showing you, was it loaded?
If I recall correctly, no, it was not loaded.
Did it come to you with a potentially matching magazine or clip?
There was a magazine that was submitted in the box with that firearm.
Showing you what's been marked for identification as Exhibit 176. Can you tell us if you recognize what that item is, please?
Yes, I recognize this as test fires that I produced from the specific firearm, as well as there is a magazine that was in here that was also submitted for this specific case, and then the packaging that I received the magazine in. I can tell that based upon the laboratory case information as well as my initials and date on not only the packaging but also the items as well.
Ooh, 176 in Evans.
Received.
So that does bring me back to the question I should have asked earlier, which is when you fired Exhibit 22, did you use your own magazine and your own bullets? How did you do that?
No, I used the submitted magazine that was submitted with that firearm.
Did you load your own ammunition into it?
Yes, we do. With test fires, we try to get, if we don't have the exact ammunition that was used, we will get one as close as possible from our reference collection.
And when you say from the ammunition that was used, from what you were given, what
Correct.
ammunition did you determine had been used?
Correct. For this, I was able to show that the fired cartridge case was manufactured by Federal.
And you used comparable ammunition in the stock that the crime lab has
Correct, yes.
for your test firings?
Correct, yes.
All right. Catch 61. Showing you Exhibit 61. Can you tell us if you recognize what that object is, please?
Yes, I recognize this as a fired cartridge case that I analyzed for this specific case. I know that I analyzed it for this specific case because it has the laboratory sticker with the designated case number, as well as the item designation, as well as my initials and date are on here.
You said it's a fired or expended cartridge casing, is that correct?
Correct, a fired cartridge case.
I'm sorry, could I have the number of that again?
61.
Thank you.
Did you examine that fired cartridge case in comparison to your fired cartridge casings from your test fires?
Correct, yes. I did do a comparison analysis of this fired cartridge case with my test fires from the submitted firearm.
How do you do that?
We use what is called a comparison microscope to do our comparison or visual analysis of fired evidence. It's going to consist of 2 microscopes that are connected by an optical bridge. This allows us to look at 2 objects simultaneously, side by side. That way I'm able to see the markings that are on the fired cartridge case that was submitted for this case, as well as the markings that were left on my test fires from the submitted firearm.
So when you say markings, where do the markings come from and where are they on the fired cartridge casing?
So the markings are going to come from different portions or different parts of the firearm. What I previously was explaining with the firing pin leaving a firing pin impression and then the breech face or bolt face leaving breech face impressions. These are the markings that I look at when I'm looking at that head stamp or the kind of top area of a fired cartridge case. That's where those markings are going to be left at, as well as the size of the cartridge case can also have markings from the specific firearm that it was fired in or chambered in.
And the markings come from what force of action being applied to the cartridge?
So the markings are going to be transferred over during that firing process, from the force of that firing process that happens. Those markings on the parts of the firearm are produced during the manufacturing process of those firearms, which then are transferred onto any fired evidence that is fired in that specific firearm.
What conclusion did you reach regarding whether or not the fired cartridge casing Exhibit 61 was fired out of the PT 709 Exhibit 22?
I was able to determine that the fired cartridge case that was submitted in this case was fired in the submitted firearm.
It may seem kind of obvious, but now that I've thought about it, I still need to ask. When you loaded the pistol with your 2 test fires, you said you loaded them into the magazine that came with the pistol, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Which is Exhibit 176.
Correct.
All right. I know it seems obvious, but I need you to tell me if it's true or not.
Yes,
if I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong. Did
No.
that magazine...
Whoa. One at a time. Question, Mr. Kaiser.
Did the magazine, Exhibit 176, seat itself properly into Exhibit 22?
Yes, the submitted magazine in Exhibit 176 did fit and function in the submitted firearm for this case.
SD 35. Showing you Exhibit 35. Could you tell us if you recognize what that object is, please?
Yes, I do. This is an unfired cartridge that I analyzed for this specific case. Again, I have all the laboratory information on the packaging as well as the actual item for this piece of evidence.
And what item did you call that for the lab?
This was item B.
While he's doing that, though, I can ask you, did you do the microscopic comparison you described to us earlier with the unfired cartridge?
Yes, I did. I used the comparison microscope to look at the chamber marks of that unfired cartridge to see if it did match chamber marks from tests that I produced from the specific firearm for this case.
What conclusion did you reach?
I was able to conclude that this item was chambered or in the to be fired position in this particular firearm submitted for this case.
So that was Exhibit 35 you're talking about?
Correct, yes.
Did you see any indications on it of any kind of misfire?
I did not, no.
Thank you. On Exhibit 22, with Detective Nicola, could you show us, you don't have to do it, but could you show us what the action would be that would cause the unfired cartridge to eject out of the pistol without having been fired?
Yes. So if you remember the picture that was up there showing that that slide was shut and that you had that indicator showing up that a cartridge was in the chamber of the firearm, that would be what's going on with this firearm. In order to manually remove that unfired cartridge from the chamber of the firearm, what you would do is slide back the slide so that it's in this position, which would allow that extractor to help remove the unfired cartridge from the chamber of the firearm, thus hitting the ejector of the firearm that'll help with actually ejecting or removing that firearm from the firearm. I'm sorry, that cartridge from the firearm.
Thank you, Detective. Is there any way to know once that happens where it's going to go?
No, it can, because you're talking about a cylindrical object, it can roll, it can bounce.
Thanks, Detective. You noted that you You noted that you received 4 unfired 9mm cartridges you identified as C2B. Were they in or separate from the magazine when you got it?
They are separate from the magazine when I received them.
Did you do any work on those?
I looked at those unfired cartridges to see if they were any type of misfires, meaning that that firing pin did hit the cartridge, but it did not detonate the actual cartridge, causing a misfire.
Showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 147 for identification. Can you tell us if you recognize what that object is, please?
Yes, this is additional fired evidence that was submitted for this case. I have a fired bullet jacket that I analyzed for this case, as well as a lead bullet core and some lead fragments that were submitted.
Your Honor, with the understanding that I will be proving up the foundation of where those fragments came from, can I proceed with the expert's opinion?
I have no objection.
Thank you. Without
I
objection.
appreciate that. Thank you very much. What portions can you go through each of the items and tell us what portions of what would have started as an unfired cartridge are there?
Yes, so when you're talking about an unfired cartridge, one of the portions that is an unfired cartridge is going to be a bullet. Some bullets are going to have ejecting material around it. So if you think of like an M&M, you're going to have that harder outside shell or coating of an M&M with a softer chocolate center. Jacketed bullets are like that, in which they have a harder outside shell or jacketing with a softer lead core. This portion is going to be that jacket material separate from that lead core. For this item down here, it's going to be a portion of a lead core as well as lead fragments.
What, if any, work did you do on those bullet fragments in relation to the test fires you had done in Exhibit 22, the PT-709?
So I compared the test-fired bullets with this bullet jacket. When you fire a bullet through the barrel of a firearm, it's going to leave rifling marks, which we call lands and grooves, which are going to have markings from that specific barrel that we look at. That's going to be left on this harder outside jacketing material. So I was able to analyze this jacket and compare it to my test fires to be able to determine if this jacket was or was not fired in that specific firearm. With these items, because I only have that inner portion that's not going to have any discernible markings on it, so these were deemed to be not suitable for comparison.
So the markings are left on what you call the jacket, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
And what is it about the barrel of the pistol that leaves the lands and grooves that you described?
It's going to be the rifling or that spiral pattern that you're going to see within the bore inside of a barrel that's going to leave those markings on the fired evidence or the fired bullets.
What conclusion did you reach regarding the portions of Exhibit 147 that you could identify?
I was able to determine that this fired bullet jacket was fired through the barrel of the submitted firearm for this case.
Exhibit 22.
Correct, yes.
Jim 66. Showing you Exhibit 66. Could you tell us if you recognize what that object is?
Yes, this is an additional magazine that I was able to determine that fit and functioned in the submitted Taurus firearm for this specific case.
And that was identified to you as item L1?
Correct, yes.
And it came with, at the time, 7 unfired 9mm cartridges, right?
Correct, yes.
But you've already answered my most important question, did it fit in the pistol you had?
Yes, it did fit and function in the submitted pistol.
No further questions?
Thank you. Let's take our mid-morning recess, ladies and gentlemen. Don't form any opinions, be any discussion, start your deliberations. We'll stand adjourned about 10 minutes, and then we'll resume with Mr. Gray's Cross. Thank you.
All rise.